Okay, well, welcome everybody to our second Zoom meeting that we have on our syllabus for this year. We've got John Barwis presenting Victoria's early maritime postal, and I can't spell postal routes. Okay, now before I introduce John, can everyone please mute their audio during the meeting? We don't want any background noise, so we can give John the ability to do the presentation properly and without any background noise. Now, if you have any questions, please use the chat function and write your questions down, and then I can read them at the end of the presentation, and we can also probably just get questions from people from the group. Just like to advise you, like I said, the meeting will be recorded and will be available on the website. Okay, so I'll stop sharing and I'll do my introduction to John. I asked John to send me a brief precis of his philatelic CV and other thing. And John says that he was lured into the philatelic world in the early 1950s by his grandmother and has never escaped. His traditional postal history and literature exhibits have won many national and international awards, the most memorable of which was the Grand Award at Stampex 99 in London for his Victoria half-lengths, his first exhibit. An expanded version of the exhibit won the American Philatelic Society's national championship. He has published extensively in the philatelic literature, including a Grand Award-winning handbook on the half-lengths. John says that his service to philately was simply a response to a need expressed by other leaders and friends. And John's philatelic positions are: he's a president emeritus of the United States Philatelic Classic Society. He has been a member of the American Philatelic Society Finance Committee since 2007. He co-founded and is president emeritus of the Institute for Analytical Philately. He's a fellow of both the Royal Philatelic Society of Victoria and the Royal Philatelic Society of London. In 2010, the Royal Philatelic Society of Victoria awarded him the Gartner Medal for his best literature for his book, The Half-Lengths of Victoria. In 2018, he was honoured with the American Philatelic Society Luff Award for Distinguished Philatelic Research. And in 2020, he was honoured by the Collectors Club of New York with the Liechtenstein Award for Distinguished Service to Philately. In that same year, he was honoured by having his name added to the roll of Distinguished Philatelist. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. John Barwis. John, over to you. You can start sharing.
First of all, can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I was talking to Frank earlier and about how I got started on Australian philately. I was living in China and came out to Melbourne to try to do an oil and gas deal with a guy that had a private bank there. He had some land somehow in central China. And so I show up in the Melbourne airport and went through customs. And the guy behind the glass said, "Where's your visa, sir?" And I said, "What visa? Do I need a visa to come to Australia? I thought we were allies." He said, no, you need a visa. Well, I'm supposed to put you back on the airplane and fine the airlines $10,000 for not checking your visa. Took me into a back room. There were about 4 or 5 policemen sitting around a table with a hot light in the middle of the table. And they grilled me for about an hour to make sure I wasn't a terrorist, I guess. And finally, I was scared half to death, and finally the guy running the meeting said, "So how long do you want to stay here?" I said, "Well, for 2 days." He said, "Australia is a beautiful country. Why don't you rent a car and drive around for a couple of weeks?" He took my passport, stamped the visa in it, and I was good to go. It's unbelievable. That would never happen in this country. I don't care if you were the second coming, it wouldn't happen. So that had deepened my love for Australia right on the spot. So during that time I was there, the meeting fell through. We just couldn't come to terms. And so I had a day and a half or 2 days to burn. And I started wandering around Melbourne. And I wandered up this street and saw a sign, a stamp store with an arrow pointing upstairs. So I walked in and it was Rod Perry's place. And Jeff Keller was in there. I spent the whole day there. Rod had a couple of frames of half lengths up. And I spent a lot of time with Jeff explaining how the printings could be discerned easily. And I just went crazy after that. I went back to China. Rod kept sending me stuff with invoices and I kept paying the invoices. And I wound up with a collection completely willy-nilly. I mean, it's bizarre how that happened. I never intended to collect Australia, and now that's all I collect. So this talk that I'm going to give today is a variation of one that I gave at Stockholmia. And I know that Gary was there. I'm not sure if anybody else was there from the society. And I've modified it a little bit. I've actually run it through a few times, so I know I'll be within your time limits. Thank you. So can you put up the first slide, Frank?
You want me to share it? Can you share it?
I thought you were gonna put it up.
Oh, hang on a minute. Okay.
I mean, I can do it my end if you like.
Do it your end, because then you can just do the slides.
Okay, let me go in and open it up. Let's see. View. That's a normal. There should be a slideshow. Oh, here it is from the beginning. Okay, can you see that?
You got to press share screen on your Zoom down the bottom.
Okay.
Yeah, do you want me to? I'll get it up.
Share screen. Oh, here we go. Share screen. You see that?
Yeah, that's it. Just do slide from the beginning.
Yeah.
That's
How's
it.
that?
There you go. That's perfect.
Okay. All right. So in philatelic exhibits and articles, maritime routes are most often drawn as straight lines connecting two ports. It makes the point, beginning and end, but it doesn't really explain anything about the route itself. And for sailing ships especially, in most cases, wind and current patterns make direct routes neither desirable nor in most cases even remotely possible. So I became interested in actual routes while reading ship news columns in the early 19th century newspapers. And they often mentioned where a ship had been spoken or where it had seen icebergs or bad weather or had wrecked or something like that. Most of those locations were nowhere near a direct route. Victoria's foreign mail is useful for studying long maritime routes because in Melbourne, everywhere is far away. And most foreign mail routes required navigating at least 2 oceans. Early mail from Victoria could travel for 9 months. And this is one of many reasons I'm enchanted by Victoria postal history. So first, I'd like to consider the ships themselves and the oceanographic conditions in which they had to sail. And then we'll look at how routes evolved from sailing ship days through the late 19th century. Then we'll look at clipper ship routes used after the Admiralty requisitioned the British flag steamers for the war in Crimea. And finally, I'll briefly touch on the beginnings of trans-Pacific mail and the packet routes that followed. I won't be considering postal rates or mail contracts, but only how letters got from point A to point B. A square-rigged ship is depicted on Mesopotamian pottery that's been dated to 5,000 years before the Christian era. And we know that Egyptians sailed square-rigged ships at least as early as 3000 BC. Beginning in the 1830s, square-rigged vessels began evolving to clipper ships, which were larger vessels carrying a lot more sail and with sleeker, much faster hull designs. Look at the comparison between the hull design of the HMS Victory, which is basically a bathtub, and the Black Ball Lightning, which is longer and sleeker. The first of these ships were built in Baltimore and Philadelphia, and then in New York. And finally, the best of them and fastest were built by Donald Mackay at his yard outside Boston. All square-rigged ships share the same limitation, an inability to sail closer than 60 degrees to the wind. Some poorly designed ships couldn't get more than 80 degrees. So here's a diagram of points of sail to demonstrate that. The wind direction in both of these diagrams is from top to bottom. At left are the points of sail for a sloop or a lateen-rigged vessel. If well designed and operated properly, when close hauled, these boats can regularly sail as high as 30 degrees from the wind direction. Some high-tech modern boats can get more closely hauled than 30. I'm sure the Australian racing boats get much higher than 30. On the other hand, a well-designed square rigger can sail only as high as 55 degrees into the wind, and poorly designed ships had difficulty sailing above 80. The square rigger's routes therefore comprised beam reach to running points of sail. So here's what controls the main control over shipping directions. The key driver of wind and current patterns is the Coriolis effect. First, consider the diagram at the left. The base of the middle black arrow is traveling about 1,000 miles an hour eastward. Why? The Earth is roughly 24,000 miles around, and it takes 24 hours to turn, so it's about 1,000 miles an hour. Theoretical projectile fired from there to the base of the upper black arrow, so due north, which is traveling eastward at a lower speed because the circumference at the Arctic Circle is smaller, will miss its target by some distance to the right. You'll remember that from high school physics. In the southern hemisphere, the projectile fired from the base of the yellow arrow will miss its target to the left. The diagram on the right shows the result of this effect. In the northern hemisphere, air being pulled into low pressure cells veers to the right, hence the counterclockwise motion in the upper diagram. In the southern hemisphere, the gyres are clockwise. These large wind gyres are the principal driver of all oceanic currents. Even without understanding the physics, for thousands of years, ship captains had a keen awareness of these patterns. Here's a simplified vertical slice through the Earth's atmosphere from a perspective directly above the equator. Air heated at the equator expands and rises, shown here in red. In the upper atmosphere, it's pushed laterally by more air rising beneath it. So it's pushed north in the northern hemisphere and pushed south in the southern hemisphere. Upper atmospheric air becomes denser as it cools, so it then descends toward the Earth's surface, where it forms subtropical high pressure zones as it spreads out to both north and south. Air flowing around the poles in the temperate zones collides with cold, dense air from the Arctic and the Antarctic, shown here in blue. In the collision zone, it rises to form its own circulation cells that flank the tropical ones. In the tropics, the prevailing winds are therefore easterly, whereas in the temperate zones, they're always westerly. So here's a map of the currents which are driven by wind. Note the clockwise gyres in the northern hemisphere and the counterclockwise gyres in the southern hemisphere. These currents were known and used by mariners for thousands of years. The Vikings, for example, came across to northern North America in the 900s, and people always show them as a direct line between Viking land and Newfoundland. But I'm guessing that they actually went south and wound up there. These currents were known and used by mariners for thousands of years. The first current velocity measurements were made by Benjamin Franklin in the Gulf Stream and were published in 1770. Franklin learned about the Gulf Stream by asking his cousin Tim Folger, a Nantucket whaler, why mail ships took so long to reach New York. Folger explained that some of the mail ships from the UK sailed directly into the adverse 3-knot current of the Gulf Stream, whereas merchant ships always avoided it. The Falmouth packets, for example, usually took longer to reach New Orleans than to New York rather than to return home. Please note particularly the Gulf Stream, the Brazilian current, the Benguela current, and the West Australian current, as these influenced trade and mail routes. This is one of the most interesting maps I think I've ever seen. A Dutch oceanographer named Frits Koek digitized the positional data from 50 years of British sailing ship logs and plotted them on this map. The tracks reflect British trade with Indonesia, India, and the colonies in the Caribbean and North America. Notice the tracks of Captain Cook's trip to Hawaii and Australia. You can barely see the line that goes off off of Queensland here. Also notice the curved track patterns in the Indian, North Atlantic, and South Atlantic Oceans. The North Atlantic gyre facilitated the route to British sugar plantations in the Caribbean, as well as to Great Britain's North American colonies. Location adds to the great allure of Victoria's foreign mails because many routing options were possible, all involving great distances. In the early days, relatively few large ships had reason to enter Port Phillip Bay. When Melbourne's population was less than 2,000 in 1841, Sydney's growth had reached 30,000 and was growing at a good clip. This explains why most of Port Phillip's early foreign mail went via Sydney until the gold rush in 1851, which kicked off the rapid increase in Port Phillip's shipping traffic. These are the destinations declared by all 3,280 ships that left Melbourne for foreign ports in Melbourne's first 2 decades. The 1851 gold rush had 3 important influences on postal history. First, more than an 8-fold population growth resulted in a lot more mail. Immigrants wrote home, so foreign mail volume obviously increased rapidly. And as destinations expanded, so did routes, evolving from 2-way mail with the UK to a more global communication network. Ships were also changing rapidly. The time bars at the bottom show the change from early British packets, say the Toulmin brothers, to the first steam-assisted sailing packets, use of clippers during the Crimean War, and the return to steam at war's end. Despite the variety of pre-1857 routes, most mail went to the United Kingdom. Before 1866, all mail carried by contract vessels, including mail to non-British addresses, went via the UK. Ship letters could, of course, be sent on private ships to any destination. Let's look at some covers and route maps, starting with the earliest and most straightforward routes. I have to caution you that the routes are not from ship logs. I made up the routes based on what we know about oceanographic conditions and wind patterns. So they're the best rational guess for what a route actually was. The first of these is the 2 Capes route to Australia via Cape of Good Hope and to England via Cape Horn. Prior to the 1851 gold rush, most of Port Phillip's foreign mail went via Sydney. This cover went to Sydney by revenue cutter, then by private ship to Deal via Cape Horn, a 9-month journey. As from 1842, the New South Wales Post Office contracted coastal steamers to carry mail between Melbourne and Sydney via Hobart. This cover's waypoints are unknown, but I suspect there must have been at least one, probably in Brazil for fresh water and provisions, and maybe for some horizontal refreshment as well, who knows. Port Phillip departures for England that bypassed Sydney were infrequent, so we can assume that senders took advantage of them. This letter went via Cape Horn, but took only 5.5 months. I've always admired Victoria's boxed town hand stamps. I think, who was it? I guess it was Max Watson had a collection of boxed hand stamps. I'm wondering where they all went. Gary, are they lurking in your collection? No response. That probably means yes.
No, they're not.
This base map is from a set of Royal Navy charts. You'll see more of these, so I'll take a minute to explain how to read it. Red arrows are prevailing winds, and the blue arrows are ocean currents. You can barely see the blue arrows. They're a very pale aqua color. Bright yellow are gales greater than 10 days a month. The shark's teeth patterns are the approximate limits of icebergs, and the stippling is known to be fog at least 5 days per month. Due to nearly constant high winds, captains were reluctant to drop into the so-called roaring 40s. By the way, the 40th parallel runs between Victoria and Tasmania, so any voyage south of Tasmania was perilous. Ships would usually call at either Rio de Janeiro or Recife, then around Cabo de São Roque, the eastern tip of South America. They could then ride off the wind, in other words, 90 degrees to the wind, into the Gulf Stream, and then sail downwind all the way home. Had the ship headed northeast from Brazil, note the adverse winds she would have faced off West Africa. There'd be no point in going this way. And indeed, the map I showed you of from the Royal Navy charts demonstrates that. So at odds here, or at issue here is, what do you want to do if you're a ship captain leaving Melbourne? How far south do you want to go? And how many risks do you want to take? One crazy American pilot of a clipper ship wore a sidearm and threatened to shoot anybody that reefed sail. He was into collecting records. You know, he wanted to be the fastest guy out to Melbourne. This is a slightly later cover, outbound from England in 1853. The sender paid the 8p ship fee, and Melbourne charged the 3p ship fee plus 2p inland in black. The 60 uniform rate wasn't in effect until later, in November of 55. The 113-day trip was relatively fast, no doubt aided by strong following winds in the southern high latitudes. You may be surprised at the most likely route this sailing may have taken. Again, I interpreted it rather than found it from ship's log. This route was indicated on the British ship tracks map I showed a couple of minutes ago. Captain probably kept both Madeira and the Cape Verde Islands to starboard on his southern route, then crossed the Atlantic to ride southwest on the Brazilian current. He probably then headed eastward. Now, why would he do that? Because why would a ship captain try to sail into these headwinds? It just wouldn't make any sense. He probably then headed eastward, just short of 40 degrees south. How far south depended on the weather, of course, and how experienced or nervy he was with respect to roaring 40s. He could maintain that latitude all the way to Melbourne, a track that looks relatively straight, doesn't it? But remember, this map is a Mercator projection, so the high latitudes are stretched horizontally. Speaking of Mercator projections, I don't know how it was in your in your primary school, but in the American primary schools, there was always a Mercator projection map of the world on the wall. And it obviously stretches out places in the extreme north and the extreme south, and it makes Russia look about 3 times larger than it really is. Somebody told me it was part of the Cold War to make the Soviets look scarier than they actually are. I don't know if that's true or not. Here's a more realistic way to consider the Southern Hemisphere routes taken by the last 2 covers. The shortest distance between 2 points on a sphere is always a great circle, which seen from directly above plots as a straight line. The red line is the great circle route between Recife and Melbourne. The letter to London traveled east below New Zealand's South Island, then stayed north of 40 degrees, only dipping south to around Cape Horn before heading up the east coast of South America. The letter from Plymouth to Melbourne could probably have traveled north to 40 degrees once rounding the Cape of Good Hope. The shortest routes between north and southbound would have required sailing well inside the 60th parallel. On both northbound and southbound routes, even at 40 degrees south, sailors routinely kept a 24-hour watch for icebergs. After the Toulmin packet service ended in 1849 and the Australian colonies were left without scheduled mail service to England, all mail to England went by private ship. One option was to send letters to meet a Far East mail steamship at any of its waypoints. This letter went to Bombay by private ship, then by P&O steam packet to Suez. Subsequently, Medusa, a Royal Navy steam packet operating in the Mediterranean, took the letter to Malta, where it again went via the P&O all the way to the UK. Although not a significant for postal history cause, the reason, the penny stamp is from Ham's first printing and is the only recorded example of foreign mail. The first leg of the trip of that cover, the King George's Sound in Western Australia, would have involved light headwinds. But from there, it was all downwind to Bombay on a course not too dissimilar to the Great Circle route. So basically, almost perfectly downwind, as you can see on this leg. From Alexandria, letters could go either via Marseille, a route available since 1839, or via Trieste, as from September 1853, but had to be so endorsed and would, of course, had to pay higher rates. From October 1870, mail went via Brindisi. The evolution of Mediterranean routes is worth an entire presentation in itself. If you're interested, I recommend Colin Tabiart's 2 terrific volumes on Australia, New Zealand, UK mails. On this map, you can see that when the P&O contract started in 1852, the Melbourne-Suez leg was pretty straightforward, but it faced minimal challenges from winds or currents. Although the Anglo-Prussian Agreement of 1852 provided for that route, it was not well advertised in Australia. Consequently, letters via Southampton or Marseille were relatively uncommon. But earlier letters via Trieste, whether from New South Wales or Victoria, are very rare. The cost to an addressee was the same as the packet letter via Southampton, but the Trieste route was faster. In this case, the mail arrived 4 days ahead of the bags from Southampton. Amazingly, when this came up at auction, I may have been the only bidder on it. If there was one other bid, I bought it for a song. And I don't understand why. I don't know if people thought it was fake and maybe somebody just wrote the via Trieste on there later.
John,
But,
I wasn't collecting at the time.
I probably wouldn't own this now if you had been. Since you just put your hand up and leave it up. But I was delighted to be able to snag this. If you're interested in this mail delay of Australian mail, it's documented in detail in a 2012 article No, that's, sorry, that remark applies to another cover. I'll come to that later. Sorry. In 1852, the Admiralty contracted with the Australian Royal Mail to carry mail between Sydney and Plymouth with multiple stops, including Melbourne. Trips were supposed to take 73 days. The contract was eventually canceled for non-performance against the time limit, mostly due to mechanical breakdowns. They simply were not ready for long distance voyages. This cover went on the first homeward voyage of a contract steamship from Australia, the first contract vessel to carry Victorian gold. On this trip, she carried 210,000 ounces, including the famous 340-ounce Victoria nugget, which was bought by Parliament and given to Her Majesty the Queen. After 1852, Melbourne experienced a large influx of Americans, most of whom had been disappointed in their California diggings, which were 80 times less productive than Victoria's. I actually looked this up. The California gold rush from 1848 to 1855 was 280 metric tons of gold. The Victoria gold rush from 1851 through 1896 produced 22,780 metric tons of gold. You can make a case that the British Treasury would have been bankrupt without the Australian gold rush. Although the ships were not up to the job with respect to oceanographic conditions, the Australian Royal Mail had a relatively easy course to navigate. Their likely route is shown here. Not only were wind and current patterns favorable, but each leg of the voyage was not far off a great circle. And unlike the Cape Horn route, the risk of collision with icebergs was minimal. On this voyage, bad weather off King George's Sound depleted her coal supply, so she was forced to stop at Mauritius, which added at least a week to the trip. By December 1854, the Admiralty had commandeered so many steamships for war that the P&O was unable to fulfill their contract. They thus withdrew from Australian service. Non-contract clipper ships from several lines then took up the slack, starting in January 1855. By the end of 1855, departures from Melbourne were bi-weekly. Of the 34 clipper ship departures from Melbourne in 1855 alone, only 13 were under contract. 9 of those were Blackball line ships. This Blackball line cover was carried by clipper ship James Baines. Her homeward voyage of 69 days was a world record. Later beaten by another Blackball ship, the Lightning, in 64 days. James Baines could spread between 10,000 and 17,000 yards of canvas. I haven't seen the ship's log for this voyage either. But what I have plotted here is the fastest sailing route under the conditions shown on this chart. How far south the ship sailed on the way to Cape Horn is unknown, but we do know that Blackball line captains regularly competed with each other for speed and were notorious for sailing below 60 south. Captains competed for bragging rights. Bully Forbes, aptly named Bully Forbes, a Blackball line captain, is reputed to have worn a sidearm and threatened to shoot anyone who reefed sail. Not all clipper ships were fast, and none were immune to adverse winds. This non-contract clipper took 110 days to reach Liverpool. To be fair, she did spend 2 weeks trying to beat stiff headwinds in the St. George's Channel off Ireland, but the voyage would still be almost a month slower than James Baines's record. In this case, the captain finally surrendered to the weather and put into Crookhaven, Ireland. The mails went overland to Dublin, where the Australian mail date stamp was applied. Tabiart tells me he's only seen 3 of those hand stamps. Callao, the harbor of Lima, was the endorsed destination of more than 350 Melbourne departures between 1848 and 1856. The bag containing this cover was confiscated by the Lima post office, who demanded an incoming ship fee for all letters in closed transit bags. 6 weeks of negotiations ensued before the bags were turned over to the Pacific Steam Navigation Company for transport to Panama. Even after subtracting a 6-week delay, this was not a speedy route for England-bound mail. This confiscation of mails at Callao lasted for several years. And there's an article about it, about what happened and how it was negotiated in the Collectors Club Philatelist in New York. And anybody that's interested, I can send you the reference to that. Here's the most likely route for covers via Callao. Each leg of the journey was not far off a great circle, even though I flattened out the first leg to avoid possible gales and icebergs. Keeping the high pressure cell off Valparaiso to port lessened the possibility of headwinds and offered an easy downwind sail along the coast boosted by the Peru current. So if a guy were just getting that cover and taking a map and plotting a route, it would seem logical to just go north of North Island and just kind of cruise across in a straight line. But then that may work, but it wouldn't be as fast as catching these high winds to the south. A group of New York investors led by William Aspinwall, and including Samuel Comstock of California Gold Rush fame, decided to create a trans-Pacific steamship company. They bought a ship, which was under construction for the Inman line. They bought it right off the stocks from under the nose of the Inman guys. They half crewed it from New York to Liverpool and filled out the crew with Brits in Liverpool. The Golden Age, as it was named, went out to Melbourne via Cape Horn and spent some time doing coastal work in Australia while coal was cached in Tahiti. Before reaching Panama, the crew were burning decking and bulkheads to keep the boilers running. The venture was a financial disaster. Aspinwall was no dummy, and he pulled a very smooth move on this. He sold the ship to another company that he owned at a loss. So the buyer of the ship got it basically for free, which was the Pacific Mail Steamship Company. And he then used it on the Panama-San Francisco run. He then sold her to the Japanese, and she did coastal work in Japan. It'd be fun to have some covers carried with Japanese stamps on them back and forth between Yokohama and wherever else they went. Despite the financial failure, 74 days was a respectably short time for mail from Melbourne to London. It also set a bar for other companies that wanted to begin to get into the trans-Pacific mail game. And that, of course, happened. Golden Age's route was straightforward, and each leg was close to a great circle. This route offered the advantage of mail connections after crossing the isthmus to either British packets at Chagra or American packets at Aspinwall, now called Cologne. The route avoided ice, gales, and headwinds, and was relatively direct despite spanning more than 12,600 nautical miles. After the Crimean War, the P&O resumed their contract sailings via Suez. We've already seen that map. I show this cover only because it reached Suez but did not transit the canal. But wait, you may say, what about the canal? It opened in 1869. And it indeed did open. However, the UK had an 1858 agreement with Egypt, under which it paid £12,000 a year for overland transport of the mails. So it wasn't until August of 1874 that a new agreement allowed mail to go through the canal, and then only for the bags via Southampton. That may seem like a waste of money by the GPO London, but it was actually smart because the canal was so narrow it took 2 days to transit, plus the risk of being grounded. whereas the overland route by camel and train took only 1 day. The Alexandria-Cairo Railroad was completed in 1855 and the Cairo-Suez Railroad in 1858. Throughout the 1850s, the frequency of private sailing ship departures to the US West Coast increased, at least in part because many Americans with gold fever had flocked to Victoria, especially following the decline of the California rush in 1856. Although the volume of trans-Pacific mail increased, one could still send mail to California via the UK, then overland across North America, prepaid to destination for 20.5 pence. There's one other cover that I know of that took this route. This is only a cover front. The gold standard one is actually the Gary Diffin's collection, and is actually a much nicer cover. This 1859 letter went by British packet to Southampton, American packet from Liverpool to New York, railroad to St. Louis, Missouri, and then a 2,800-mile, 28-day stagecoach ride to San Francisco. These stagecoaches would run for 24 hours and then stop at a waypoint, pick up a new team of horses and run it for another 24 hours. It was quite amazing, actually. On this cover, the rate breakdown is 6 pence for the uniform rate, 1.5 pence for British Transit, 8 pence transatlantic, and 5 pence from New York to California. The 1.5 British Transit was redundant because it was already included in the British American contract. So the rate was later lowered to 19 pence or 38 cents. Australians had campaigned for a mail route via Panama, but Rowland Hill's 1863 report to the Postmaster General rejected that idea. He gave 4 reasons. Australian mail already consumed more revenue than it generated. The route via Suez was cheaper. The route via Suez and Gibraltar was the shortest at 13,100 miles, and the route via Panama was the longest at 15,300 miles. So New South Wales and New Zealand, not giving up, joined up to contract their own service. 4 iron screw steamers were built in the UK and sent out to Australia. The sailings of this line would be from Sydney to Panama via Wellington and Rapa Nui. This cover was paid only to the port. So in San Francisco, it was charged 10 cents for a letter arriving by incoming steamship. The likely route from Sydney to Panama was close to a great circle. Neither prevailing winds nor currents were unfavorable. At Panama, mail could either enter the British or American mail systems before crossing the isthmus. After 1855, the crossing was by railroad. From the north side of the isthmus, 2 packet services were available: the Royal Mail Steam Packet to Southampton or the Pacific Mail Steamship Company to New York. At Panama, this letter went into the bag for San Francisco via the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, which was owned by William Aspinwall, the guy we talked about earlier. This pioneer route closed in early 1869 as too costly. Bad press about passengers having contracted yellow fever at Chagra didn't help much. During the 1870s, 5 shipping lines tried to make a go of service to San Francisco for connection with the Transcontinental Railroad, which opened in 1869. Most stopped at Honolulu, but all of them failed as too costly. Effective July 1st, 1878, the U.S. Victoria Postal Convention established a prepaid rate to destination of 12 cents to the U.S. and 6 pence in Victoria, in the U.S. and 6 pence in Victoria. No accounting was necessary because each country would retain all postage. Registration was set at 6 pence in Victoria, 10 cents in the U.S. All letters were to be stamped at the origin with "paid all" in red. The U.S. Transcontinental Railroad journey took 4 days. Note that the GPU had started earlier. but it was only 21 countries, and they were all in Europe and North America. They had agreed a rate of 25 centimes among themselves. 25 centimes, had Victoria somehow magically joined the GPU, wouldn't have covered the cost of shipping this letter. Service via Sydney and Vancouver started in 1893 with the so-called all red route, called that because mail between Australia and the UK would theoretically not cross any non-British territory. The service was contracted jointly by the Canadian and New South Wales government. New Zealand chose not to participate, despite this route being marginally shorter than the Melbourne, via Melbourne and Suez. Service was monthly, with calls at Brisbane and Honolulu. From Vancouver, mail went across by rail from Vancouver all the way to the east coast of Canada or to New York. This particular cover went to Prince Edward Island, just offshore New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. It traveled over 14,000 kilometers in 42 days. Here's the likely route of that cover. Each trans-Pacific leg of the route is close to a great circle. This letter went to Sydney by rail, bypassed Fiji, stopped at Honolulu, and traveled the entire length of the Canadian Pacific Railroad from Vancouver to Moncton, New Brunswick. A ferry then took it across to Prince Edward Island. This was an efficient route for mail to Canada. At 41 days door to door, it was faster than the letter had the letter been sent via the P&O, then via transatlantic on Cunard, a trip that would have taken 43 days just to New York. The Canadian-Australian line was eventually bought by the Union Steamship Company of New Zealand and continued well into the 1900s. Each trans-Pacific leg of the all-red route amounted, it was close to a great circle. This letter went to Sydney by rail, bypassed Fiji, stopped at Honolulu, and traveled the entire length of the Canadian Pacific Railroad from Vancouver to Moncton. So Valparaiso, Chile is a complicated cover. This cover really stumped me for quite a while. And I couldn't figure out how the heck did this thing get to Chile. You know, I obviously had to go via the Pacific because there were no British markings on the front or back. And it wasn't endorsed for anything. The endorsement here says south, which, you know, unless you pull up that label, you're not really sure what it said. At first, I thought it was Southampton, but under bright light, it's not. So the sender paid 2.5 pence for the UP rate, plus 3 pence for registration. The routing is very unusual because it sailed in the Pacific Ocean twice. The two maritime voyages being interrupted by a 3,000-mile trip across North America. So this letter went to Vancouver. Then it got put on a small inland steamer to Tacoma, Washington. There it went on the railroad across the northern tier of the United States through Chicago to New York. At New York, it was put on the Panama Railroad Steamship Company vessel from New York to Cologne. They ran once a week. Cologne used to be Aspinwall on the north shore of Panama. Then it went by rail across the isthmus to the town of Panama. And from there, the Pacific Steam Navigation Company ship from Panama to Valparaiso, where it arrived on the 7th of February. Only 41 days. A pretty amazing cover. So I've tried to bring a slightly different perspective to the study of long distance maritime mails, although it's important to understand postal treaties, mail contracts, rates, and routes. I found that learning about the physical controls on ocean voyages has deepened my enjoyment of postal history. and has attracted me to covers I might not otherwise have considered. So I appreciate your attention, and I'm happy to take questions and comments.
Fantastic.
Excellent. Thank you. I got one question for you, John,
Yeah.
from Alan Shatton. It says, how many covers are there from Victoria to Prince Edward Island?
Wow. I don't know the answer to that. There can't be a whole lot.
There's not many.
No. I don't even know how I begin trying to figure out how many. Gary, you might know.
Um,
I reckon that one's unique.
keep talking, I'll get back to you.
I like the word unique, and I've used it a few times in exhibits, and judges always snare me on it. They say, "Oh yeah, really? Well, my third cousin has 4 of them." This kind of thing.
Well, there's not many
Prince
people
Edward
in
Island
Prince
to
Edward
Victoria,
Island.
I think there's one.
One other one.
I
I
think
don't even remember where I got it, but it's probably in a dealer box somewhere.
There's not many people live on Prince Edward Island.
No,
No,
that's for sure.
geez, I would have thought Gary would have had that one in his collection.
Yeah.
Well, we can always make deals.
there's only one from Victoria.
Yeah,
Oh.
that's it. That's it.
Okay, well,
There you go. It is unique, John.
yeah, there you go. Maybe Gary will take it, trade for his letter to California.
I own that Prince Edward Island cover.
You did? Why did you get rid of it?
No, I still own it.
Oh, so that means there's 2 of them.
There's 2 of them.
It depends on the when Prince Edward Island became part of the Dominion of Canada.
Oh, that's much later.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mine's dated 1865.
John,
That's all
John,
right. Prince Edward
John,
Island
you would-
was not part of the.
Yeah,
Not
this
part
is
of the
96.
Dominion.
So this is part of the Dominion, I think, isn't it?
I think so.
Yeah, so yours is much earlier.
Yeah.
Well, there might be 2.
You do see some of the these. You don't see Newfoundland a lot at all. You see New Brunswick.
Well, the Newfies, the
Vancouver
Newfies,
Island, there's only a couple.
yeah.
So I think
So,
it's going to be open for more people for questions before I start.
Any questions? Any other questions
can
from
I-
anybody?
Can I ask another question?
Yeah,
Sure.
of course.
John, how did you work out the route that cover to Chile took?
Well, first thing you have to do is you have to sign up for newspaper archives, some of which are not free. And so
Yes.
I use the newspaper archives in California and in Seattle and in Quebec, Montreal, and New York, and the British newspaper archives. And so I was able to go into the Vancouver papers and find out when it actually arrived there. And that matched the November 29th hand stamp you see on the front of this cover.
Yes.
Then I went into the newspapers in Seattle, and I found out that the city of Kingston Puget Sound steamship, they're really small steamers, left Vancouver shortly after the Warramoo had arrived in Vancouver. And so you work with a theoretical arrival date. It took a day to get from Seattle to Tacoma, or from Vancouver to Tacoma. And so you're always working with 2 or 3 dates for any nodal point. Then I knew that the cover had arrived in New York on the 7th of January because there's a back stamp.
Right. Yep.
And from there, I had to figure out what was the first steamer going to Cologne out of New York. So I go into the American newspaper archives, which are free. They're at the Library of Congress. That's all online. And the first steamer to leave New York for Panama was the Panama Railroad Steamship Company vessel to Cologne. And that company was basically just a feeder line for their railroad. They also owned the railroad. So you're always working with 3 or 4 options of each leg. And of course, when you string them all together, they have to make sense. The key principle is post offices didn't fool around for favorite ships or anything like that. Mail went on the next available.
Yeah.
Worldwide, unless a letter was endorsed otherwise,
Hmm.
For a certain ship or something like that, or via a certain route. And I've found over the years that's a pretty successful approach. And obviously I had cheat sheets as well. I had Colin Tabbyart's book, which was filled with arrival and sailing dates. I had the North Atlantic Mail Sailings book from Dick Winter. And the California State Archives. There's even an archives in Florida, of all places, of the Cuban newspapers. If you read Spanish, you can go back and see arrivals and departures from Havana. So the stuff is out there, and more sources are appearing online all the time.
Thank you.
It's
That's very
yeah, it's
interesting.
like an equation with 6 unknowns, and you have to make sure you rejigger them all.
Frank, can you hear me?
Yes.
It's Ronnie Winchester here.
Yeah, g'day, Ronnie.
That cover of 1867 will be very interesting to analyze, because the Dominion of Canada came into effect on the 1st of July, 1867.
Are you talking about Gary's cover, you mean?
The one that I don't know who it was, but somebody said they had a cover to Prince Edward Island dated 1867.
That's Gary's cover.
But as I say, the Dominion came about on the 1st of July, 1867.
Okay, so yeah.
So Gary, do you recall offhand what the route was paid?
Yeah, it was 3 times 6pence, so it's 1 shilling 6pence with the adapted design, and it went via Southampton off to London, via Liverpool, and then went across from Liverpool to Prince Edward Island.
Right,
probably
to
to New
PEI.
York or Boston or
Okay.
Quebec, and then to Prince Edward Island.
Yeah, because there was a line that ran into Montreal and Quebec.
Yes, there was the Allen line, I think it was.
Yeah, and this new book that Dick Winter and I are putting out has the non-contract sailings on that line. Of course, the contract sailings are already in Dick's 1975 book.
I've always thought there was other lines that took mail, because sometimes the dates didn't match up.
Yeah.
I've always thought that, and I can't wait till that book comes out, because I'll be one of the first putting my hand up to buy it.
Yeah, I can't wait either. It's been a long time.
I know you've been working on it a long time.
We wouldn't have.
You're writing all his covers then.
Well, it's interesting. We only did the book because of COVID. Dick lives 1,000 miles from me, and he called me one day, and we were both going stir crazy. And he said, "I've always wanted to do this book. Do you want to do it with me?" So we worked every day for 2.5 years and pounded out the book. And the American Philatelic Society is going to publish it in the next month or so. Kept us from going crazy.
Unsurprisingly.
Any more questions from anybody?
Just fabulous.
Thanks for listening, guys. I appreciate it.
Now, can I hand it over to Gary to do a vote of thanks, please, Gary?
Ladies and gents, what we've seen today is a very, very condensed and brief history of how the mail was sent from Victoria. And I'm surprised that John was able to condense it in such a small way, covering off all the different types of sailing ships, contracts, etc., and illustrating them with each of the covers and showing how they got there. The thing that's interesting about it is, you know, let's face it, aside from New Zealand, probably Melbourne's the arse end of the world.
Oh, I
Well,
think Hobart is really.
The best,
Well, okay, that's a little bit further out. But the
best
thing
place
is,
in the world.
it's such a long way, and especially when you're trying to send mail to or from Victoria or Port Phillip at the time. I mean, John illustrates an 1838 cover, and the thing is, what we do is we take for granted about how these things got there. We take for granted about the knowledge that these people had because it's not passed down from generation to generation. All this stuff about ships' currents, the circumference of the Earth, getting down below the 40th parallel to the 60th on occasion. All this information is generally lost to people in our age. And what John's able to reproduce here is this is what the people at the time, these were the guys on the ground, and this is what they did. The ship's captains knew about these currents, even though they may not have documented them all that well or documented in a way that is well known for everybody else. But they knew about the currents and how to be able to steer their ships to take advantage of them. So all of the early letters follow that particular path. So when we get to some of the interesting things is and because of the discovery of gold, if it wasn't for gold, we'd probably still be having sailing ships coming to Australia rather than steamers. But because of gold and because of the value of it, everyone was looking to see how can we get the gold and by essence the mail back to London or other destinations as quickly as possible. And we're in the age of the Victorian ingenuity. Victorian ingenuity, we're looking to find out what's the fastest route. How can I build the fastest ships? How can I get steam, etc.? Let's experiment with all of these things. So what John's shown us here is not only the sailing ship mail, but mail that's gone overland via the Suez Canal. And the Suez Canal at the time was one of the wonders of the world. Mail via Trieste, the first mail contracts because of gold between the ARM and the P&O lines. When all of that stopped, we went back to sailing across with the clippers and that golden age of the greyhounds of the seas. We're always experimenting, looking to go via Panama with the golden age, which was a complete debacle. And then we're looking to, John shows us other mail that's gone via stagecoach across the United States. It's just crazy. And then we start to look at how do we get contracts via the Panama. And then what we did find was having the rail from San Francisco and Vancouver. It's cheaper to have mail and quicker to have mail on a railroad than it is in a steamship. So all of this is the development of mail from 230 days from 1838 to 40 days in 1896. So if you look at the number of days that it takes to get mail from Victoria, from Melbourne to London, you're looking at a difference of about 180 days over a period of 60 years. It's really quite remarkable. 60 years to get to 180 days. And that's all told in what John's presented here today, and also in the covers from Victoria, showing how all of this happened. And this was history in the making, and history in trying to be mail routes and other routes to be able to get your produce to market quicker, etc., etc. So I'd like to thank John for taking us through this. I think it's interesting for all of us because not only is this, it shows detective work about finding how the covers got there, but also about understanding what the ship's currents were, the sailings and all of that. It's really difficult to work out. And once you start going through this stuff, it becomes a little bit easier. But I tell you what, there's always things that stump all of us. So thank you, John. I've enjoyed it. I have a vested interest in this because that's part of what I collect as well. And the other thing that I think everybody needs to be aware of is that I think John, and Jeff Keller would possibly know this, I think John is the only philatelist that's actually exhibited Victorian colonial mail via routes and via the various routes. I don't think anybody else has done it. People have had the collections like Purvis and Rod Perry, but they have never exhibited like the way that John does. So congratulations, John. I enjoyed it immensely, and I hope everybody else did too. So thank you.
Thank you, Gary.
Sorry that took so long.
Okay, no, thanks very much for inviting me to present this stuff. And I hope to see you at the big show in Melbourne in a couple of years, if I'm still on the right side of the grass.
Oh, you should be, John. You're doing all the work right now.
But I concur with Gary. Look, you know, doing the presentation the way you did, the maps, and then the way the mail went, I think I've learned a hell of a lot in regards to that, and I think a lot of people here have, just opened their eyes up. I think so. Thank you very much, John. It was very good and excellent presentation. Now I've got some mundane, formal items. We've got one membership that we got last in a couple of weeks from Dion Smith, which is his application is on the notice board at Purvis House. So if there's no objections, he'll be admitted as a member in a couple of weeks' time. Any other announcements before I get onto the other announcements? Has anyone got anything to announce?
Frank, John Shorty, if I can just mention one thing.
Yes.
John, I'd like to say personal thanks on behalf of the Royal of Victoria for your support of our website. It really has made a very big difference, and we were very pleased to be able to match your very generous offering. But on top of that, may I just say that I have the American Philatelist in front of me, and your article on Beyond Expertising. You've been a consistent contributor to this hobby. God bless you for that. And by the way, having worked in the around the world, the idea of the arse end of the world, I think Nigeria might feature in your thinking.
I think it's actually I think the sphincter is Manhattan Island.
Oh, we won't go there.
Yeah. All right, for our local members, future meetings. We've got on the 5th of July. We've got the daytime meeting with Helen Watson doing Papua New Guinea Classics. The Postal History Group on the 13th of July at 7:30 p.m. I think that's posted at sea, John. Still.
Yep.
Sorry.
Yes.
Posted at sea, John Strawley for your postal history.
I'd muted myself there, Frank. The answer is yes, it is posted at sea, but after this evening, I feel somewhat embarrassed about the topic.
Shouldn't.
You'll be right.
And then our philatelic meeting on the 21st of July at 8 p.m. We've got the Papua New Guinea side display where Lou Smith was going to display GRI collection. And then the library will be open on the 30th on the 30th of July at 2 p.m. Any other comments? Anything else anyone wants to announce? No? Well, then I can close the meeting. And I'm thinking again, thank you very much, John, Mr. Barwis. It's really
You're welcome. You're more than welcome.
Good
Would you like to stay on for a second? We'll have a chat.
Yeah, I'll stay on.
Yep.
Cool.
Yes, it was really good, and I think these Zoom meetings show us that we can have some very good international presentations from around the world, and we can see things that we wouldn't otherwise see. All right, well, good night all.
We're going to stay on a bit, Frank. So
yep. You can stop sharing your screen, John.
That's a great picture of Melbourne.
I got that on the internet.
Did you?
Great.
Yeah. I was looking for something when I first started doing Zoom meetings. I was looking for something to put in the background because I was doing a lot of international Zoom meetings, and I thought, well, Melbourne, you know, is a good pick. I just wanted to find something that's got the whole of Melbourne, and that one just caught my eye.
I've
So
got a
of
friend
this-
of mine who's got an apartment, and I reckon it's a little bit lower down, but that's the view that she's got.
Oh, geez.
Ah.
That's the view that she's got.
So if I were to take that picture and delete the buildings built after, say, the year 2000, how many of those tall buildings would disappear?
Half of them.
Yeah, I was going to say about half of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, my first trip there was in the 90s. I don't remember so many big buildings.
Yeah.
And
They got a
look,
lot of them now.
oh, look, probably in the last 10 years, they've just gone up like anything. And, you know, they've also, renovated a lot of older buildings and added onto them.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, luckily, when the city was laid out, there was a lot of land dedicated to open space and green space, which you don't have in most big cities.
That's
No,
true.
that's right.
I was talking about that last night with Governor Latrobe did that in, I think it was the late 1840s. He just said, well, here's a big block of dirt and that's going to be parkland. It was Fitzroy Gardens. And here's a bigger block of dirt, which became the Royal Botanical Gardens.
Yeah.
And here's another block of dirt, which became Flagstaff Gardens. They were very
So
lucky that they had that vision.
He's a visionary guy.
Yeah, he was.
Well, even you look at the new subdivisions that are happening, you know, they're always looking for green belt land to try and have, you know, the green belt within the subdivisions, and some of the smaller subdivisions, it's all concrete.
Yeah,
You know, there's no greenery around anywhere other than on your nature strip.
yeah. And the other thing they should do with every subdivision is that all the ones that are going out further north or further west, they need to build the rail out there first before they build the houses.
Yes, exactly.
And then all of a sudden, no, we're not going to build the railway because it costs too much. I mean, how dumb are this lot? I mean, really?
Yeah. In our township, the zoning where we live is that you cannot have a property smaller than 2 acres, which tends to help